Hello, my friends. In this video, we'll see what Jesus says will happen at his return from the passage in Matthew 25 about the separation of the sheep and the goats. It's the final judgment, and everyone will be there. I mean, everyone. This is video 11 in the Olivet Discourse series, which explains Matthew 24 and 25, the long answer Jesus gave to his disciples' questions on the Mount of Olives. And it's time to look at the separation of the sheep and goats, which is the final judgment at the end of history. But why think this separation is the final judgment? Well, first, remember the passage is in answer to the disciples' second question. What will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? When Jesus returns, it's the end of the last age and the last day of these last days in which we live. Hebrews 9:26 says of Jesus, "But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." When Jesus appeared in his first advent 2,000 years ago, it brought about the end of the ages. Therefore, we live in the last age. So when Jesus returns at the end of this last age, it's the end of history. Hebrews also says of God, "In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son." We live in the last days and have been for 2,000 years, so the end of the age is also the last day of these last days. And as we saw in the parable of the 10 virgins, Jesus himself said the resurrection is on the last day and the final judgment is on the last day. Since we see the return of Jesus and the judgment of the righteous and the wicked in our passage, it's the final judgment on the last day. But there's another reason. This sheep and goats passage ends with the beginning of eternity. The last line is verse 46, which says of the goats, "And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life." After this sheep and goats judgment, the wicked spend eternity in hell, while the righteous spend eternity in heaven. Therefore, this is the final judgment on the last day of earth history. And this is the same as what we saw earlier in the passage with the returning master, the parable of the 10 virgins, and the parable of the talents. When people are cast into outer darkness, the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth, that's hell. When people are sent to hell eternally, that's the final judgment. All right, now we're ready to read the passage and see what Jesus says will happen at his return at the end of this last age. "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left." Jesus is the Son of Man, and he's coming back in our future, just as a bridegroom comes back to fetch his bride, as we saw in the 10 virgins parable. But this time he comes in his glory with all the power of God, not like his previous coming as a man with many of our weaknesses. Notice in this passage, everything is done according to his will, and no one even tries to fight back or rebel, because Jesus in his glory is in complete control. We also see that the angels are with him. This idea can be seen also in the wedding motif, because a returning groom might bring with him servants from his father's household as part of the groom's party. For Jesus, the angels are servants of his father's household, which is heaven, where he went to prepare a place for his bride. But now how many angels are with him? It says all the angels. And how many angels are there? From the scriptures, it's always tens of thousands. And if they're all coming back with Jesus, this must be a very important occasion. There's no other place I can think of where all the angels show up, not even at the birth of Jesus. What event could be so important that all the angels are in attendance? Well, the second coming of Jesus, for the final judgment at the end of the last age, after the resurrection on the last day. A very important occasion indeed. It says, "At that time he will sit on his glorious throne." Now, this doesn't mean only at his return does Jesus become king. He is already King of Kings and Lord of Lords now. Nor is it the first time he sits on the throne of God. That happened 2,000 years ago, as we read in Hebrews 1:3. "After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high." And in the book of Revelation, Jesus says in his own words, "The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on my throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne." Notice these are past tenses. He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty, and he sat down, past tense, on God the Father's throne in heaven. So why does our passage say that at his return he sits on his throne? Well, it was well known in that culture that a person in authority would sit on a throne or judgment seat to render a legal decision, such as to give a verdict in a trial. In the culture of the day, that's the context in which we have to read the passage. And we can see examples of this sitting for judgment in the Bible. When Jesus was brought to Pontius Pilate accused of treason, Pilate finds him innocent and wants to let him go, but the crowds threaten to riot. We read, "From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, 'If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar.' So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement." Pilate has been stalling up to this point, but when he sits down on the judgment seat, his legal decision is final, and he ends up delivering Jesus over to be crucified. In Acts 12, King Herod Agrippa also renders a judgment. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and they came to him with one accord, and having persuaded Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for peace, because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat upon the throne, and delivered an oration to them. These people have asked for peace, so King Herod sits down on his throne to render a final judgment. Note the word here translated throne is the same one used of Pilate sitting on his judgment seat. For Herod, it says throne because the translators know that a king would sit on his throne to render a judgment. And that's exactly what we see in Matthew 25. Jesus is the king who is taking his seat to render a judgment, the final judgment. But there's more, because this is also an Old Testament picture. In the tabernacle and temple, the Ark of the Covenant stood in the Holy of Holies. The lid of it was called the mercy seat because it represented God's throne in heaven where he sits. Once a year on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would enter the most holy place and kneel before the mercy seat on the ark, petitioning God on behalf of the people for the forgiveness of their sins. God was pictured as sitting on the mercy seat to render judgment on the people, and the high priest wore an ephod with 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. So when he went before the mercy seat, the entire nation was pictured as gathered before God's throne to receive judgment. But in our New Testament passage, it's Jesus whom all the people are gathered before to receive judgment. Jesus sits on his throne to render that judgment, so Jesus is shown to be Yahweh, the God who dispenses mercy, and the King of Israel. Again, this is the cultural context which the disciples would have understood when Jesus said all this. Also in the Old Testament, we find passages that have similar wording to our passage, such as in Psalm 96. "Say among the nations, Yahweh reigns. Yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. He will judge the people with equity. Then shall all the trees of the forest sing for joy before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the people in his faithfulness." So Yahweh God reigns as king, and he comes to judge the nations. But here in Matthew 25, King Jesus reigns as Yahweh God, and he comes with all the angels and sits on his throne to judge. And who does he judge? We just read it. Before him will be gathered all the nations, just as in Psalm 96. This phrase, all the nations, means everyone. Abraham was told, "In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." Jesus brought that blessing, and salvation is made available to everyone. And when all the nations are gathered before him for the final judgment, that means everyone who has ever lived. So while this passage doesn't mention the general resurrection of everyone, we can know it happens on the last day, and so does the final judgment, so that resurrection must come before this judgment. And remember, we did see the resurrection in the parable of the 10 virgins, which teaches the same events and answers the same question from the disciples. Next, it says he will separate the people as a shepherd separates sheep and goats. Why does a shepherd do this? Well, during the day, the sheep and the goats can graze together safely under the watchful eye of the shepherd. However, at the end of the day, they have to be separated into different pens because goats are aggressive and will attack the sheep and injure them. Goats will bite and kick and charge the sheep, who pretty much won't defend themselves. Since the sheep and their wool are a valuable commodity, the goats must be removed to protect them. Now, the sheep represent the righteous, God's people, while the goats are the wicked, unbelievers. During the day, which represents this earthly life, the righteous and the wicked are mixed together, but since our shepherd is not physically here, the wicked goat people attack and injure us Christians, the sheep people. These two groups, the righteous and the wicked, will be mixed together until the return of Christ in our future. But at the end of the day, which represents the close of earth history, the shepherd separates sheep and goats. And this teaches us that at the end of this last age, Jesus returns and the wicked will be separated out from the righteous because God can't allow evil in his presence. These two groups of people cannot spend eternity in the same place. So in this life, we will always have tribulation from the wicked, but it won't be that way into eternity future. Now, when he separates the two groups, the sheep go on his right hand, a place of honor in that culture. The goats are placed on his left-hand side, the contrasting place of dishonor. Jesus then explains how the groups will be judged. Now, I'm not going to cover that now, but in the next video. But by way of a teaser, it seems to some people that the basis of judgment is your works. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those who are sick and in prison. Aren't these works? But the rest of the Bible is clear that we are saved by grace through faith and not by works. Is Jesus contradicting that and saying we are saved by these works of charity? Well, no, of course not, but I'll take the next video to explain what is really the criteria by which all people will be judged at the final judgment. But for now, I just want to concentrate on those events that Jesus says will happen when he returns. We already saw that the righteous go to eternal life in heaven, while the wicked go to eternal life in hell. This is confirmed by what Jesus says to each group and the direction of motion that they take, because each one travels to a prepared place. First, to the righteous sheep on his right, Jesus will say, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." The kingdom of heaven has been prepared for the faithful, and that's where we're going. Jesus, the bridegroom, said to his bride, the church, in John 14, "I go to prepare a place for you, and I will come again and take you to myself." That's what a groom always did in that culture during the time of preparation, when bride and groom lived apart for about a year. We saw all this in the parable of the 10 virgins, how Jesus uses the wedding customs of that day to describe his return. Just as a groom returns to fetch his bride and take her to the house he has prepared for her, Jesus will return to take us to himself in the place he has prepared in his Father's house in heaven. So in this passage, he says to the faithful, "Come." This Greek word is used to beckon someone, "Come here, come closer," because Jesus is taking us to himself and to our Father in heaven, closer than we can possibly be as we are now. And just as a bride is taken to the groom's father's house, Jesus will take us to his Father's house in heaven. Therefore, he doesn't say to the sheep, "Stay right where you are, I'll come to you." But he says, "Come, you come to where I am. And so where I am, you also will be." And what does he say to the wicked goat people? "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." Just as heaven has been prepared for the righteous, so hell has been prepared for the wicked. And while the righteous move closer to God when he says, "Come," the wicked move farther away when he says to them, "Depart." Hell is separation from God, the source of all good. It's the greatest possible separation and the terrible fate of the wicked. Now, I don't wish hell on anyone, but we should recognize that a perfectly just God must punish sin. Either Jesus pays the bill for you or you pay it for yourself. It's your choice. And God respects our free will, because without it, you cannot love God and Christ and your neighbor as yourself. At the final judgment, Jesus tells the wicked, "Depart," not "remain where you are." because both groups are going to a place prepared. This is further confirmed by the last line of the Olivet Discourse, because Jesus said, the wicked go away into eternal judgment, while the righteous go away into eternal life. These words, go away and into, show the movement of the two groups. Neither one is told, stay where you are. One is told, come closer. The other, depart, leave. So neither one is left behind on the earth. The wicked go away from here and are thrown into hell. The righteous go away from here and are carried into heaven, because the earth is not our true home, as I explained in another video. Now we can put all the pieces together. What does Jesus say will happen when he returns? In his own words, the red letters, first, Jesus is coming back with all the angels. There will be a general resurrection of everyone who ever lived. All those people will be gathered before Jesus for the final judgment. He will separate them into two and only two groups. Each group is sent off to a prepared place. The wicked go away into eternal judgment in hell, while the righteous go away into eternal life in heaven, in the direct presence of God. Each group will spend eternity in their prepared place. That's what Jesus says will happen at his return, so we can have confidence in this. Now, there are a lot of teachers today who say something different will happen, but I'm sticking with what Jesus said, and I want you to be aware of what he said. The return of Jesus and what will happen in our future is something we put our hope in. I want to hope in the right things, the things that Jesus taught. I don't want to have hope in a falsehood, even a falsehood that tells me what my itching ears want to hear or tells me what will gratify my flesh. So whenever I hear any end-time scheme that differs from what Jesus taught, I reject it. The true hope is this: Jesus will return on the last day to fetch his bride, the church, and take her to her permanent home in heaven. I'm looking forward to going there, and I hope you'll be joining me. And I pray this video has blessed you. Thanks for watching. Keep an eye out for the next video. God bless you.